What if I told you right now, quietly but powerfully, one of the biggest investment opportunities in Australian property is unfolding in plain sight? While most people are focused on the day-to-day news cycle, savvy investors are looking a few years ahead, 2032, when Brisbane is going to step into the global stage to host the Olympics and the Paralympic Games. But here's the thing, the real gold rush isn't during the Games, it's the decade leading up to it. Billions of dollars are already pouring into infrastructure, suburbs are being transformed, jobs are being created, and investor interest is quietly surging before the rest of the world catches on. So in today's show, I'm joined by Brett Warren, National Director of Property at Metropole, and one of the sharpest minds in strategic property investment to help cut through the headlines and zero in on where the real opportunities lie. He's been based in Brisbane all his life, so whether you're already in the Brisbane market or wondering if now's the right time to act, this episode could be a game changer for your investment journey. So let's dive in.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Hi, Brett. You and I have been watching the Brisbane market evolve for years, actually a couple of decades now, but it really seems to be that we're standing at the edge of something big, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? It's there's something special in the air at the moment. And if I rewind a decade, it was a bit of a quieter period in Brisbane. But I think, with the Olympics coming up, I think there's some big things on the horizon. And potentially the last decade's a good prelude because things didn't really start to kick off in Brisbane until we had a lot of infrastructure growth and new projects happening and stuff. And it's kind of like a round two on steroids with the Olympics. And it's not just about medals and athletes, obviously, that's capturing the headlines. It's all about what happens before and after the Olympic Games and also the Paralympic Games as well. And I think property investors and hopefully listening today will get some insight out of that because it isn't just a sporting event. It's really going to reshape Queensland economy, the population, the infrastructure, also positioned on the world stage as a global image and, may not be in the same league yet as Sydney and Melbourne, but it's certainly going to push towards that, isn't it?
I think it is. I know in the past you've written about Melbourne and Sydney being world cities, a well-known, well-renowned, Melbourne for sporting events, Sydney for its Harbour Bridge and the Opera House. It probably has other things going for it as well, but let's not go into that. But Brisbane was, I guess, what we would call a new world city. It was up and coming. But I agree with you. The Olympics are going to put it on the world map and that'll bring tourists. But as you said, I think it's much more than just that couple of weeks about the Games. But let's start with the big picture. How do you see the Olympics affecting Brisbane's trajectory over the next decade or so? Because it's actually less than a decade now, isn't it? It's what?
It is.
7 years to go?
Yeah, 7 years to go. And look, I spoke to a real estate agent the other day who had people calling him from overseas wanting to know how close this is to the Olympic precinct and can I buy it? And, I'm not even looking at things. And we're still another 7 years away and the talk is there. But look, I certainly think between now and then there's probably going to be a bit of a slowdown in the market. I think there just has to be. We're at, I guess, a peak at the moment with affordability and things like that as well. And we're getting close to that with interest rate cuts. So I think there'll be a bit of a pause there. But as I said before, I think, we had a period there over a decade ago where there wasn't much happening and all of a sudden we had this huge infrastructure boost. And that's really what's going to happen now, except it's going to be, I guess, on a much broader scale throughout Brisbane. And that's just going to create huge demand for housing, for rentals. And also, I guess some of those jobs, those where people may move to Sydney or Melbourne and people from overseas come and take up those jobs will now be placed in Brisbane. So I certainly see it as an opportunity. And with the fundamentals so one-sided at the moment, Michael, there's just not enough properties being built, is there?
Well, let's just put it into context. The Brisbane market is now at new peaks. If we look at Cotality, it used to be CoreLogic's figures, Brisbane dwelling values grew 73.6% over the last 5 years. That's not doubled, but it's actually getting close to that in 5 years' time. In the last 10 years, it actually almost doubled at 91%. What you are saying is true. You can't have double-digit capital growth, and in particular for apartments, they they've done really well as well. You can't have that year after year after year. So I think what we're both suggesting is, yes, the Brisbane market's going to slow down a bit. It's not going backwards. It's not going anywhere because there's still some very, very strong fundamentals, but it's going to be more moderate growth. But we've lived through periods of quite moderate growth in Brisbane before when we first started working together, when the market in general was flat, but that didn't mean there weren't some pockets that strongly outperformed. I think that's one of the good things about real estate. You can beat the averages.
Yeah, you can. And I guess that's what we're here to talk a little bit about today, right? Maybe help investors, give them some insight and give them some thoughts on where they should be putting their funds.
Well, you wrote an article about it on Property Update, which I'll link to, where you suggested the Olympics would be more about a legacy than sport. Now, that's something coming from somebody who's so sporting oriented as you. But what did you mean by that?
Yeah, like I said, it's really not just about the games or a sport. I guess in the past, decades and generations ago, they'd put a village out somewhere and stadiums out somewhere, and everyone would have to go out there. But it's a real opportunity to actually redesign a city, redesign transport networks, hubs, the way people move and the way people live. So it's a real opportunity to do that. And as you said before, let's get a bit of a facelift for Brisbane and bring it up to that world standards. I guess now they're looking at, doing things within the inner city, within other locations and linking them up in transport networks and nodes and adding infrastructure and walkability. And I think it's the legacy after that also. So it's not only what's happening beforehand, but it's also transforming Brisbane at the back end. And there's kind of $7.1 billion worth of those upgrade and infrastructure projects. And it's not just going to be about Brisbane. There's 30 sports and transport projects around, southeast Queensland. And I guess that the locals will benefit from that well beyond that 2032 Olympic Games.
Well, yes, there's going to be a whole lot of infrastructure changes. And as I said, I'll link to the article where you've actually put those down. But maybe you could just walk through some of the major ones and how you think they're going to affect living in Brisbane.
Yeah, so I guess the first one is the Cross River Rail, and that's linking up the CBD with some of those hubs, those inner city hubs, and that'll make it very easy. It's taking a lot of traffic off the road and congestion off the road. It's a subway type system. It's about 10 kilometres worth of rail within about 5 to 6 kilometres of the CBD. So there's 4 new underground stations. There's going to be upgrade to 8 existing stations, and there's direct access from those outer suburbs into the heart of Brisbane. And, you think of those subway systems in Sydney and on bigger scales, New York and London. So that's a really important one to start with.
If we could just say in London, as an example, I don't know much about New York, but I know that's one of the favourite parts of the world for you. If you live too near the tube, as they call their underground, it's not that good. But if you live within walking distance of it, it actually makes a huge difference to property values, people wanting to live there and rent there. So it's much the same here. You don't want to be right on that station, do you? But right suburbs and the right locations in those suburbs are going to get a boost.
Yeah, and we might dig a little bit deeper on, but I think that's a really important point to make because people are naturally pushing towards those suburbs thinking, but it's all going to be physical growth, and you don't want to be too close to that because there's going to be a lot of congestion, a lot of high-rise buildings, and a lot of precincts and things like that as well. So, the next one we're talking about, Michael, is the Brisbane Metro. That's been in the pipeline for a while. That's a high-frequency bus system that I guess, has its own dedicated, pathways. You're not stuck in traffic. You're not having to wait it's behind peak hour traffic and things like that as well. And that's going to go throughout South Brisbane, through the universities. And I guess the parts of the southern corner lacks a bit of a train line, and that's going to, I guess, take its place. So that's around 1.7 billion. That's going to be really, really important because it's going to just be like a train, really.
Well, I think both those infrastructure projects you talked about are going to be critical as Brisbane grows as a city. And if your governments get it right, and it looks like they're heading in the right direction, it doesn't matter how many people live there, as long as you see that in Tokyo, you see it in New York and London, as long as you can get them around, I guess you've got to get them off the streets, and great public transport will make a city much more livable.
Yeah, they certainly will. That Gabba precinct's going to be really critical too, because that's where there's going to be a lot more being built there. There's going to be more plazas. There's going to be more retail. There's a Cross River rail stop there. There's some new residential and commercial projects. So there's going to be an absolute huge amount of physical growth in that pocket there coming through. And then we're starting to move outwards and look at things like green
Just on
bridges.
that, though, there will be a lot of growth and a lot of development. But just to remind listeners and viewers what you said, you don't want to be right there, do you? Not in the centre of it.
No, certainly not. And there's a couple of little fringe pockets around there that are being developed and have probably been undervalued that we'll identify in a moment, but you're 100% correct.
Yeah.
And we're just starting to increase that livability. So, we've just added some more green bridges. I was just out at Kangaroo Point last week. We took the family over for the first walk, and that really linked up that Kangaroo Point precinct to the CBD, which has really never been done. You used to have to take a huge amount of walking or driving around to get there. So that's a real benefit. Getting from the CBD to the Gabba on foot is probably been ruled out most of the time. And there's other things out towards the Breakfast Creek and the universities out to West End, which have been critical as well. And I guess probably the biggest eyesore in the inner city at the moment for Brisbane, Michael, is that North Shore Hamilton precinct, which is a lot of industry. There's a lot of vacant land out there, and that's going to be transformed with the Olympic Village. And there's a new thriving waterfront suburb out there with lifestyle precincts as well. So that's going to be a real benefit to Brisbane and that particular area.
I think Brisbane's going to look so different in 7 years' time, as we said, not even in a decade. But accessibility to these things is going to be what drives value, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And as we said before, accessibility is important, but you don't want to be right on the hammer there and right in the mix of things.
So it's actually not just Brisbane, though. The Olympic opportunity is going to spread around southeast Queensland, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Some of the regions are set to benefit as well. There's things there, Sunshine Coast are getting indoor sports centres and stadiums. There's a new development happening with Logan and Redlands, and there's upgrades to the existing 2018 Commonwealth Games facilities in some ways, and certainly those transport improvements connecting the three big hubs of Brisbane, the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast are going to make a huge difference as well.
Well, people migrate to where jobs are. Queensland's got more than just jobs. It's got good weather, even though looking at what you're wearing today, a jumper in Queensland, that's quite unusual. But if there's infrastructure growth, job opportunities, I think people are going to be moving not just from overseas, but also from interstate. They've been doing that for a long time. In fact, Brisbane's shaping up to be Australia's next growth magnet. Queensland's population is projected to hit over 6 million people by 2032. But the bulk of that's going to be concentrated in Brisbane and, to be fair, the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast as well. Many families are now priced out of Sydney, and for a while now they've been choosing Brisbane as a more affordable lifestyle location, Brett.
Well, they have, and I think the joke probably doesn't fit that well today, Michael, but I remember we used to say you could buy 2 properties in Brisbane compared to Sydney, so it's probably 1.5 now.
Not anymore.
Not anymore, but that's still going to continue, and I think that affordability is a big push in Brisbane, and people, and in particular investors, identify that we're at the bottom of that huge wave coming through with the Olympics, and it's probably an opportunity to get into that.
Well, people are going to live everywhere, but as property investors, you're wanting to choose locations that are going to outperform the averages, as we said a short while ago, and that'll relate to gentrification, but also the type of people. It's not a judge of people, but the type of people moving there who've got higher incomes and who can afford to and are prepared to pay more to live there, either as landlords or as owners or as tenants. And there'll be the ripple effect. So yes, the Gabba and other locations will develop, and then there'll be a rippling out of opportunities around those locations. Are there certain areas, locations that you're going to be getting our team at Metropole to concentrate on?
Yeah, certainly. We already are. I think the Gabba we talked a little bit before is a big precinct, but you don't want to buy in the Gabba. I know there's a lot of people looking to invest into the Gabba, but I wouldn't be investing in a location. There's going to be an abundance of high-rise apartments and abundance of noise and infrastructure and things happening. But there's a couple of sleeper suburbs on the outer there. East Brisbane's still a developing suburb. If we move a little bit further north, there's an area called Dutton Park, which is a real tiny suburb, really undervalued, and it's also been rezoned for a major school catchment to rival Brisbane State High. So I think those pockets are really important in those inner city areas. Even Annalee's another area, although you've got to watch for those infrastructure challenges as well. But if you're getting into those purely residential areas is important. And then extending beyond that again on the south side, you've got an opportunity there to get into those areas that haven't had a train or haven't had access to the CBD with the Cross River Rail, and also the Brisbane Metro extending beyond that. And I think that just offers an opportunity for the north side as well, with some infrastructure and close to the airport. There's some major hospitals out that way as well.
So what you're saying is that investors should have a look at where the infrastructure is going, where the new developments are going, do your research. I know that already there are interstate buyers agents recommending Brisbane. We've been through this before, and there are some very good professionals out there, not just the team at Metropole, but I also know that there's people who don't understand the local market. More than that, they don't even go and have a look at it. And the local selling agents do a FaceTime video of properties and tell them let's buy, you should buy this. So I think you've got to be careful whose advice you take looking at Brisbane. I think one of the things we're suggesting is targeting gentrifying inner ring suburbs. They're probably going to offer more potential for capital growth moving forward, where, as you said right at the beginning, other parts of Brisbane are reaching their affordability cap. In those more affluent areas and also downsizer areas, people have got a lot of equity in their home. People who bought their home 10, 15 years ago have very minimal mortgages, and so they're upsizing, right-sizing, downsizing. And I know that we help a lot of home buyers at the moment, and many are not fussed by interest rates because they got so much equity in their homes.
Well, a lot of those suburbs, I think probably 2/3 of people in that area have either paid off their mortgage or a fairly significant way into it. So we're also speaking of gentrification. I mean, we talk a little bit about the baby boomer generation moving out of those suburbs over the next 5 or 10 years. And I think that's an opportunity to get into those areas at a good, reasonable price, affordable price. And as the market kind of changes and gentrifies and people add value and knock properties over and repurpose properties, I think there's huge potential in those locations.
So we also accept the fact that there are opportunities in the Sunshine Coast and the Gold Coast, but in general, we at Metropole like investing in the big capital cities. It's just not worth fighting the gorillas because there's so much force behind it with multiple industries, multiple economic pillars underpinning the Brisbane property market moving forward, and demographic changes too.
Yeah, look, and I think, there's still a lot of supply in those markets. I don't think there's a lot of supply within 10 or 15 Ks of Brisbane, but, the Gold Coast is a vertical city, isn't it? So there's always going to be more apartments being built. And while there's good areas there, I would prefer Brisbane, and Sunshine Coast still has a lot of land to be developed and linked up. So certainly those landlocked locations in Brisbane where all this infrastructure is coming to and all the jobs are being created, I think it's a bit of a no-brainer.
Well, interestingly, we spoke a couple of weeks ago about recording this particular podcast based on the article that you've written. And in those last couple of weeks, I've seen quite a number of articles and 3 or 4 other podcasts already discussing this. And I thought, is it too late? Or should we have mentioned this earlier? I think one has to be careful who you listen to. So with all this growth potential, how do you suggest investors avoid the hype and actually make smart long-term decisions rather than just listening to the latest podcast or blog?
There's a bit of art and science there, Michael. So the art is certainly important, and so is the science, getting the numbers right, getting the detail and the data right. But it's also really important to have that, I guess, the knowledge at ground and perspective, the perspective at ground level, knowing one area from the other. I know I spoke to an agent the other day that a person just wanted to buy something 5 Ks from the city because it was the Olympics, and they ended up paying a silly amount for a property in a flood zone. So knowing those locations, the property received water in various floods and things like that as well. But the agent's not going to tell you that. So not only the numbers, the perspective, the better locations, knowing where the school boundaries are, knowing where these new projects are going to be developed, you just need someone at ground level. You can't just buy anywhere. And I think a good point you mentioned at the start there as well, if you really want to not just get an average property that's going to do well, but get a property that's going to outperform the averages, and over a decade or more, could be $300,000-$400,000 difference, you're going to have to get that ground level perspective to make the right decision.
Okay, so any other mistakes that you've been seeing interstate investors make, Brett?
Yeah, like I said, I think you said before, just kind of taking a generalist view and getting into those locations, hearing that there's something coming to Wollongabba or hearing that there's something coming to Hurston, and that they're just buying blindly in those locations, hoping things will go up. So it's a bit of a buy and hope strategy without actually having the detail and perspective to know, no, don't do this, do that, and having someone there to help guide you.
Well, interestingly, you said a buy and hope strategy. In fact, it's not really a strategy at all, is it? So I think that we've always talked about starting with a strategic plan. One of the other things I know we help a lot of our clients with at Metropole in Brisbane, but also in Melbourne, is actually buying old homes close to their use-by date and pulling them down and building 2 townhouses or separate homes, as they often are in Brisbane, not to sell, not to flip, not to trade, but to own good long-term investments. I see lots of opportunities in Brisbane with the gentrification we've been talking about. You just have to understand what the local planning laws are. They're very different from state to state, aren't they?
They certainly are. Look, I think that's a great option too, because strangely enough, people coming up from Sydney and Melbourne don't really like our little pre-war, post-war kind of homes, the ones that don't have any character.
They're ugly.
So, by taking those properties and removing them and actually putting in 2 beautiful, modern, contemporary homes, they're driving that kind of demand. that indoor-outdoor lifestyle that's so famous in Brisbane. We can incorporate those into the designs
Yes.
and really get that, tug on the emotions. And those kind of properties sitting in your portfolio for the next 20 or 30 years with good builders warranties. And, it's a great opportunity to do so. And, they're the kind of, I guess, not trophy homes, but they're the kind of premium properties that homeowners and people coming up to Brisbane are going to want to live in and are prepared to pay a premium to buy, but also prepared to pay a premium to rent those properties during that period as well.
They definitely do. And I know in the suburbs where we've been buying for our clients to do that and then helping them become what we call armchair developers, where our team runs the whole process from buying the property, but doing a feasibility before so the client knows what's in store, helping them get the finance and the right ownership structures to be able to do it, renting it out while you get the development approvals, then supervising the builder, putting it all together, and then ending up with a long-term investment. In those suburbs, you go down the streets and every street's got a development like that happening, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Some of those older Queenslanders are now past their use-by date. But the
Yep.
problem is you do need local knowledge, because even in some streets, on one side of the street, you can do this sort of development and others you can't, or just this one end of the street you can, because there's restrictions on what you can pull down in Queensland.
There is. If your house has been built prior to 1946, it's a pre-war home. You can't generally take it down. It might be character protected. But then right next door or across the road might be
Yeah.
a post-war home, and you can tear
Yeah.
it down quite easily. We've also got to look at the slope. We've got to look at the flooding. Stormwater runoff's a big issue, and that's what a lot of people don't consider. They
Yes.
look at flooding. They don't look at stormwater. And you would think, Michael, that every property you build would have a stormwater and a sewer line, but that's not the case. Sometimes
Not in
the old...
Queensland.
No.
That's one of the things I learned early in the piece when we started doing developments there. Very different. You'd think by right you'd actually have access to a sewer and stormwater. You
Yeah,
don't
you would.
necessarily.
No, look, in the outer suburbs you certainly do, but the infrastructure in the inner suburbs had not allowed for that. So,
No.
you could buy a development site that looks fantastic and it's being advertised as a development site, but you may not be able to remove the house, or there may not be access for a second sewer line, and that will run into issues. And obviously we want to try and avoid that as much as we can.
Now, interestingly, while we read the property news and we're maybe a little bit immune to all the negative messages, there are positive messages coming with regard to interest rates falling over time and sentiment improving a bit. But there's a lot of people sitting on the fence at the moment, maybe waiting for a perfect moment. What would you say to them?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's never a perfect moment, Michael. I think there's always something on the horizon and always something happening in the economy or overseas. There's always a reason not to move forward. And I think if you ask most investors and most of the people I speak to, once we've actually secured the property and gone through the property and reviewed their property, their first comment they make to me is, I wish I had done this 10 years ago.
Yes.
So I think the right time is when you're ready, and you may not know if you're ready, but talking to someone and understanding your financial position, making sure you've got buffers in place to ride out the good and bad times. And I guess playing out those strategies, what happens if this happens and what happens if that happens, and having that, the know-how that if something does happen, and it likely will at some stage, you've got the ability to ride through that and get through to that longer term picture. Because I think no matter who's listening to this podcast today, I think it'd be a brave person to suggest that property prices won't be well ahead of where they are now in a decade or so time, despite whatever's going to happen next.
Sure. I see Brisbane entering the 2030s with better transport, strong economic foundations, global recognition, and a vastly improved urban experience. All these people coming in are going to improve the local shops, give more amenities to the location. And I think those who invest now before the rest of the world catches on, because there will be a little rush before the Olympics if we see what's happened in other parts of the world and also in Sydney. I think those who get in now will be holding on to Olympic gold. Having said that though, Brett, apart from the Olympics, we know that at the moment there's a window of opportunity for strategic investors just because of the general economy, nothing to do directly with the Olympics. Right now we're seeing a conglomeration of a whole lot of fundamentals that support the property markets moving forward. As you said, maybe not a double-digit growth like Brisbane experienced, but this isn't only in Brisbane. And if you have a chat with our team at Metropole, that makes no difference where you invest. We just want to outperform the markets, and this is a great opportunity to do it. But I think as interest rates keep falling this year, as confidence returns amongst buyers and sellers, we're entering the next phase of the property cycle. And historically, that's when the best capital growth is delivered for those who get in early. So why not take advantage of the underlying fundamentals as well as the Brisbane's economic fundamentals with the Olympics? In other words, falling interest rates, lack of supply, rising cost of construction of new dwellings, more people wanting to move in. So why not have a complimentary wealth discovery chat with one of the wealth strategists at Metropole? It's complimentary, it's one-on-one, and will help you clarify your financial goals. See what you want to achieve. Is it realistic? Will also help you understand how these macroeconomic trends that Brett and I discussed will affect your position. And we'll show you how we can build you a personalized, data-driven, strategic property plan. And that will allow you to get ahead before the others pile in. So go to metropole.com.au. I'll leave a link in the show notes, metropole.com.au, and just get some practical, tailored guidance based on our decades of experience. Brett, we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We help our clients safely build intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice.
Yes, and I think the key word there, Michael, is safely, particularly at the moment. But it's interesting, you've talked a little bit before, Michael, about people waiting for a sign. It sounds like you've just mentioned 4 or 5 signs there that would really interest me in moving forward and maybe suggesting that it could be a time to investigate things further. So, I think it'd be crazy not to take you up on the offer.
Well, we've seen it before in Sydney. It's not just about gold medals. In some ways, it's the golden opportunity for investors who are thinking strategically and acting early. It's not too late in this cycle yet to get into the Brisbane market, even though there have been some pockets of really strong growth. I think Brisbane's set to follow the footsteps of Sydney and other world cities that have had Olympics. So if you're listening to this or watching this and wondering whether it's the right time, that window of opportunity is open. Won't stay open forever. Go to metropole.com.au. Brett, look forward to catching up with you again next week.
Thanks, Michael. Always good to talk about Brisbane.
My pleasure.
Bye.
As a way of having a bit of fun in these podcasts, I've been introducing a property trivia question each show to give you, my listeners and viewers, the opportunity to win a hard copy of one of my best-selling books, How to Grow a Multi-Million-Dollar Property Portfolio in Your Spare Time. By the way, everyone who enters the competition is actually going to get a free report as well. So I'm going to ask the question in a moment and then just go to propertytrivia.com.au and enter your answer. And each week, 3 correct answers will win a hard copy of my book. By the way, don't worry if you're listening to a slightly older episode because your entry will still count. So this week's question is, which property tax introduced in the 1970s still remains a significant source of revenue for state governments today? Which property tax introduced in the 1970s still remains a significant source of revenue for state governments today? Go to propertytrivia.com.au, enter your answer, and you've got a chance of winning a hard copy, a real copy of one of my books. And also, everyone who leaves an answer will get an updated property report, and I'm changing those regularly. So even if you've left an answer a while ago, happy to give you a different report.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I'm going to ask you a question. What's really holding you back? Look, you've probably heard the quote before. It isn't the mountains ahead of the climb that wear you out. It's the pebble in your shoe. And that was famously said by the boxer Muhammad Ali. Now, I find myself coming back to this often when speaking with people, not because it's poetic, though it is, it's actually quite clever wording, isn't it? But because it offers a brutally honest mirror for those of us striving to grow, whether it's in wealth, whether in business, whether it's personal success, whatever. We all have mountains in front of us. They're big, they're obvious, they're intimidating. The business that you haven't started, the financial freedom that you haven't earned, the investment property portfolio you haven't built, the health goals still sitting on your to-do list, the relationships you've neglected. It's easy to point at those mountains and say, that's what's stopping me. But here's a thought I'd like to share with you in my mindset message. What if the mountain was just a distraction? What if the real reason you're not moving forward is something much smaller, something you've learned to ignore, something so familiar you barely notice it anymore? It's that pebble in the shoe that Muhammad Ali was talking about. The pebble isn't loud, it doesn't announce itself, but it's there, quietly, consistently irritating you there. The limiting belief that you keep repeating to yourself, the bad habit you justify as not that bad, the negative person you're afraid to cut loose, but the procrastination disguised as planning, analysis paralysis, the inner critic dressed up as realism. It's easy to overlook that pebble, but walk 10 miles with it in your shoe and you're going to feel every step, aren't you? Just like the 1 degree error on the plane, of course, ends up miles off target. These small frictions compound day after day, year after year. The pebble becomes the real reason you feel stuck, drained or frustrated. And the most dangerous thing about it, you can convince yourself it's not the problem. You'll keep staring at the mountain, hoping it moves while the pebble slowly eats away your momentum. So my mindset message to you today is don't just tackle the mountain. Remove the pebble first. It isn't about ignoring the big goals. Yes, we've all got mountains to climb, but before you throw more energy at the mountain, take a moment to check your shoes. Ask yourself, what small belief or behavior is quietly sabotaging my progress? What story do I keep telling myself that's no longer true or useful? What habit would I drop today if I really wanted to go further, faster? Sometimes removing the pebble makes the mountain a whole lot easier to climb because friction in your days becomes resistance in your life. So let go of what's quietly holding you back and you'll be surprised how quickly you can move forward. Thank you for spending the last little while with me. I hope you got some benefit from this show. But before you move on to the next podcast you're going to listen to, let me remind you I have another show that I produce once a week with leading demographer Simon Kirstenmacher. We call that Demographics Decoded, where Simon and I unveil the trends that are going to shape your future. In my mind, this is a must-listen-to podcast for anyone interested in property investment, but also for business people and entrepreneurs. So if you don't currently subscribe to Demographics Decoded, just please stop for a second and subscribe on your podcast app where you're listening to this or on YouTube. And of course, if you don't subscribe to this show, the Michael Yardney Podcast, why not click the link that says follow or subscribe wherever you're listening right now. So twice a week, you're going to get benefit from my guests and me. And I'd like to ask you a little favour, please. If you did enjoy today's show and you know somebody who would also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney Podcast and Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcast, there are 3 little buttons at the top of the player. Or just tell them about it. Just have a chat with them. Now, I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing me a favour in my quest to help as many people as possible to become financially literate. And by the way, I've got a special bonus for you as my way of saying thank you for subscribing. Just go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where I've got a bunch of ebooks and reports. It's just my way of saying thank you for taking the time to listen. And remember, the information that we give you in this podcast is general information, not specific information about your personal circumstances, because we don't know about them. But if you do want specific information, you can always have a chat with my team at Metropole. Go to metropole.com.au. If you really want to learn more, you can always listen to the previous podcast, the many episodes we've already published. Just go back to the old episodes, which each have lessons about property investment, success, and money. Once again, thanks for listening to today's show.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney Podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney Podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael, but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?